It has been over a decade and a half since the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. It has been a time of confusion, controversy, and debate. Yet one thing is certain. Every Alaskan, native and non-native, will share the consequences of this powerful and far-reaching law.
All Alaskans should be concerned about who controls their destiny, who makes things happen in Alaska. And if you end up with out-of-state people owning, or corporations owning the land, then you have little control over what they do with it.
Well, I think it's in the best interest of all Alaskans for land that has traditionally been owned by Native Alaskans to remain in the ownership of Native Alaskans.
Since the passage of ANCSA, Alaska Natives have become the largest private landholders in Alaska. To gauge the impact Native ownership of land has on the rest of the state, it is important to note just who owns Alaska. At 217 million acres, the federal government is the largest landholder in Alaska. Federally owned lands comprise about 59% of Alaska. Next, the state of Alaska owns over 104 million acres, or roughly 28% of the state. This leaves 48.7 million acres of Alaskan lands that are privately owned, just over 13% of Alaska. This 48 million acres is the only land in Alaska not controlled by state or federal governments. Of this 48 million acres, Alaska Native corporations own over 90%, or roughly 11% of the entire state. Who controls these lands in the future will have a significant effect on the Alaskan political and economic scene.
It's better for natives to own the land they do, because then it'll be people who are concerned, who live here in Alaska, that make the decisions on how that land is used.
That would create, I believe, a major problem in Alaska to have substantial acreage, particularly acreage in western Alaska, to be owned by outside corporate interests or even foreign interests. I think it's much better to allow the land to be owned by people here in Alaska.
Since 1971, some native lands have been developed as real estate or for raw materials that could be taken from them. For many native corporations, this development provides a welcome influx of cash in addition to much-needed jobs for corporate shareholders. But the majority of native lands remain largely as they have for thousands of years. To the natives who live and hunt in rural Alaska, these lands sit at the heart of what it means to be an Alaska Native.
Oh, get it! Oi! I got away! You gotta get yours! You gotta get yours! Whoa! Whoa!
Can Alaska's native corporations guarantee that corporate lands will remain in native ownership?
Under the current law, I'm convinced that the ANCSA corporations can, in fact, cause native lands to be lost.
Everything that corporation owns is at risk. It's just an asset of the corporation.
They need to retain their lands for subsistence reasons. They need to retain their lands for a profit-making viability. And they need to earn a living off their lands.
Under existing ANCSA law, there are at least 3 ways that native lands could be lost: bankruptcy, corporate takeover, and taxation. Native corporations will not have to worry about takeovers or taxes until after the year 1991. But corporate failures, or bankruptcies, have already begun in 2 ANCSA corporations: the Bering Straits Regional Corporation in western Alaska and the Haida Village Corporation in southeast Alaska.
If the corporation has a horrible business failure and the banks come to, obtain a judgment, they can go to every asset you own. You can't hide. And that's of huge concern to us.
But ANCSA corporations don't have to fail to lose possession of their lands. On January 2nd, 1992, even the most successful native corporations will be at risk of losing their land by corporate takeover. Most profit corporations are owned by stockholders. The stockholders own stock or shares which represent their share of the corporation. In many corporations, shares of stock are sold in markets like this one on Wall Street in New York City. The purchase of stock in a corporation usually entitles the owner to three things. First, the stock itself, the value of which will rise and fall depending upon the success of the corporation. Second, a dividend payment, which is usually a percentage of how much money the corporation made in a given period of time. And third, the right to vote in the election of the corporation's directors. It is the directors of a corporation who make the decisions on how that corporation is to be run. A corporate takeover occurs when one corporation buys a majority share of another corporation's stock. When Corporation A buys up to 51% of the stock owned by Corporation B, a takeover occurs. Corporation A can then vote in a new board of directors and do as they wish with the assets of the newly acquired corporation. It is this concept of takeover that has Alaska Natives concerned.
Whoever owns and controls the corporation then owns and controls all the assets, including the land. And so the land is at risk.
If there is another more powerful interest out there like a multinational corporation or any other domestic corporation, or even the management within that native regional corporation has enough funds, and they do have enough funds, to come forward and buy out 51%, a simple majority of the shares from individual native shareholders, then they control the corporation. They own the corporation.
Under existing ANCSA law, no native corporation stock may be sold until after the year 1991, at which time new stock will be issued which can be bought and sold just like the stock of any other profit corporation. When that time comes, Alaska Natives will, for the first time since 1971, be able to sell their shares of stock for cash.
Almost all the natives live in rural Alaska, where the cost of living is pretty high. They're unemployed, very poor, and they have needs, just like everybody else. They need to go see a doctor in acreage. They need money for that, and if they have an opportunity to sell their stock, all they have to have is a need for that cash, and they'll sell it. And if they do, then we stand the chance of losing the land. So that's the biggest threat.
Another threat that 1991 presents to native land comes in the form of taxes. ANCSA provided that undeveloped village and regional corporation lands would not be subject to state or local property taxes for a period of 20 years after the passage of the Act. After 1991, however, undeveloped native lands could be subject to taxation. For the smaller village corporations with an abundance of land yet a scarcity of cash, the end result could be devastating.
To a lot of the smaller corporations, that could potentially bankrupt them.
Large amounts of land would mean large amounts of taxation. I don't know that the corporation can survive large taxation.
Even if it's $1 an acre, these village corporations won't be able to pay, and they'll lose their land.
Piece by piece, cash-poor corporations would be forced to sell off parcels of land in order to feed their growing tax debt. Once again, it would seem that the very law that returned Alaska Native lands would also take them away. Bankruptcy, corporate takeover, and taxation. Just 3 of the many ways in which native lands could be lost. Alaska Natives fought for the land they received so that future generations of Alaska Natives might benefit from its use. Whether or not young Alaska Natives will ever have a share in the settlement remains to be seen. These young men are both full-blooded Yupik Eskimo, yet the one on the right received stock in a native corporation, while the other did not. The young man on the right was born before the ANCSA cutoff date, ANCSA issued stock to all the Alaska Natives of 1/4 or more Native blood and who were born on or before December 17, 1971. All Natives born after that date received nothing from the settlement unless by inheritance. This created two distinct groups of Alaska Natives, those with stock and those without.
It is a very emotional issue where families are divided, I mean, very vividly divided, and you can see that in various testimony that has been presented by one member who is 15 years or older and another one who is younger.
I'm an enrolled shareholder. My children, however, will not have a direct or indirect interest in my native ancestral lands.
Basically, it was never the intention of any of the Native leadership at that time, or even now, to cut anybody out. That was something that Congress did. They just said, okay, you're going to get a settlement, and it's going to be now, and that's it.
It was to protect future generations that led us to form these corporations in the first place. Otherwise, we would have taken the cash, $1 billion, distributed among the people who were in Alaska at that time, and given them the land on a per capita basis, and there would have been no management concept for that vast area of land.
Congress created the ANCSA corporations in the first place. If Alaska Natives are to keep their lands and their people intact, they must turn once again to the federal government. Through a congressional amendment, ANCSA provisions may be modified to provide more options for the Alaska Native community.
We've amended this act about 37 times, and we've probably changed 60 to 70 of the original provisions.
In order to amend ANCSA, Alaska Natives must speak with one voice on the changes that are to be made.
You have to agree on what needs to be done. You need to convince your elected representatives that these changes are necessary, and then you need to go and convince the individual congressmen and senators.
Well, it's the lack of consensus in the community, as I said. Some corporations just don't want certain options. Others want, no, I think there's some people that don't want any bill at all.
44 million acres of Alaskan land. Land that sustained entire cultures for centuries. Land embroidered with the footpaths and grave sites of a people who embraced it so tightly that they themselves were woven into its fabric. Acquiring legal title to this land was a challenge that Alaska Natives met in 1971. Reaching a consensus on how best to retain those lands will be the challenge of today and for years to come.
Regardless of whether there are options there for everyone, there are always those who would say, I like my options, but I don't particularly like the options that Corporation Y over across the regional boundary seems to want for itself.
One of the things that we're trying to incorporate into the 1991 amendment legislation is to transfer the land from the corporation ownership to the tribal government ownership.
Throw the scoundrels out and go back to traditional law. Go back to Indian law, Indian sovereignty. Run it the way you used to run it in the old days, where the people could speak democratically and could all be involved.
The basis of their identity, their culture, their spirituality, everything is tied to the land and the environment in which they live, and if they can't pass that on, we may as well just terminate ourselves right now.
But if nothing else happens, if all the money is blown, if the corporations go to pot, if we're able to take that land and keep it in Native ownership, then I believe, everything that has transpired thus far will have been worth it.
The question is not how we fit into ANCSA, but how ANCSA fits what we want as Alaska Natives who forever want to be Alaska Natives.